Hello, this lecture will present one of the arguments that the Nyaya philosophers give for the existence of the self, focusing particularly on the notion of a substantial self. Recall briefly that the overall argument strategy that the Nyaya philosophers use is as follows. First, we identify various phenomena that the Buddhist cannot disagree with. The Buddhist philosopher must acknowledge that these phenomena are part of everyone's experience. That includes things like pleasure and pain. But the Nyaya philosopher's burden is to show that these phenomena can be explained only if there is a self, and only if this self has certain features that the Buddhist philosopher wants to deny. What we'll be focusing on in this lecture is the feature of being a substance or a thing. And so what we'll do in this lecture is look at an argument that a substantial self needs to be posited in order to explain things like desire. And along the way, we'll get a better sense of what it means for a self to be substantial. Most of what we're considering for this lecture is Uddatakara's view and the various statements that he presents in favor of a substantial self. He expresses his view as follows, quote, "These items, desire and the rest, are qualities, and qualities demand things other than themselves in which to reside," end quote. So his point is that the various phenomena mentioned in premise 1 of the overall argument, things like desire, pain, pleasure, and so on, are qualities. And what does it mean to be a quality? It means to be a feature or property of something, and such features or properties cannot really just be free-floating entities. So you might think about various qualities in general, like colors. The color red always has to be of something. That is to say, you can't have something that's just red, just pure redness itself, just floating in the air. Rather, you need something to be red. It's a property of something. It qualifies something. So when you see the color red, it's a red bird. It's a red t-shirt. It's red of something that you see or have an experience of. And so too with anything else that counts as a quality. Anything that's a quality needs something in which to reside. And that thing in which they reside is a substance or thing. Now recall that the term substance literally just means something that stands under. So when I say that there needs to be a substance for various qualities, there needs to be a thing that stands under the qualities, that supports the quality's existence. So with the color red, you need something to support its existence by giving the redness a place to adhere. And so one helpful metaphor here is to think about a pincushion. The pincushion itself is a substance on my metaphor. Now, the various pins in the pincushion are the various properties or qualities of a thing. So we're looking at the pincushion with the pins overall as an individual item out there in the world. And each individual item out there in the world has to be made up of the substance itself and then the various qualities, which are the pins. And on this metaphor, you can't have the pins just exist on their own. The pins can only exist if they are stuck in a pincushion. You don't have free-floating pins out there in the world. So what this means on Uddatakara's view is that qualities such as desire, if we treat desire as a quality, it's like one of those pins, and it needs something to support it. It needs a pincushion to support it, and that pincushion, it will turn out, is the self. Let us now look at how Uddatakara supports this view, and we'll go through a series of steps. First, he says, because desire and the rest, pain, pleasure, and so on, all those things are impermanent, they are not self-supporting. They are like color and other material qualities which depend upon the substances in which they inhere. Notice the view here is that desire is something impermanent. It's something that you have strongly at one moment, but it will go away eventually. Pain you have at one moment, it'll go away eventually. Each of these things are not permanent. They eventually will subside. Udittakara's view is that anything like that needs something permanent supporting it. And he compares such mental qualities like desire, pain, and pleasure to material qualities like color. As I've said previously, color can't just exist on its own. It needs something to support it. But then there's a further question of what exactly supports qualities like desire. What sort of thing can support desire, pain, pleasure, and the rest? Well, Udittakara says, quote, "Furthermore, these are not qualities belonging to the body, since they do not inhere in material substances." In material substances being ruled out, we identify these as qualities of a self, a psychological substance. The general view here seems to be that consciousness and various forms of consciousness, such as desire, pain, and pleasure, cannot be reduced to the brain, cannot be reduced to something that's merely material. Rather, there's a distinctive ontological entity, an immaterial substance that supports psychological features, and that is what the Nyaya philosopher calls the self. So that's Udittakara's argument, and we can reconstruct that argument to get a better sense of exactly how the argument runs. First, we begin with that premise, that desire, aversion, effort, pleasure, pain, and knowledge, all those things, they're impermanent. But because everything impermanent must be supported by something permanent, these things too must be supported by something permanent. There must be something that stands under those qualities. That is to say, there must be a substance in which they inhere. But they don't inhere in material substances because they are forms of consciousness, and on their view, forms of consciousness cannot be reduced to material things. So there must be a psychological substance that supports them. That is to say, there is a substantial self that is of a distinctive ontological status. Notice with this argument that the very first premise is something that the Buddhists themselves would accept. They accept that desire is impermanent, that aversion is impermanent. All those things ultimately lose their existence. But we might question whether the Nyaya philosopher has done a good job building on that thing that is commonly accepted, because many steps in this argument could be disputed by the Buddhist philosopher. We have at least 3 different types of objections that can be raised to the argument. First, the argument relies on an inference that since qualities such as desire are impermanent, they need to be supported by something permanent. But it's not so obvious that something impermanent needs to be supported by something permanent. Maybe everything ultimately is just impermanent. After all, that's the Buddhist view. And so one could argue that maybe something like desire as a quality needs to be supported by something else. That something else need not exist permanently. Why think that what supports it has to be itself permanent? But the Buddhist philosopher would actually go further. The Buddhist philosopher, recall, holds that there's ultimately 5 different kinds that exist, the 5 aggregates, or the 5 skandha. And those 5 things are ultimately just simple qualities, and they don't need to be supported by substances. That is to say, the Buddhist philosopher doesn't accept a distinction between qualities and substances. They don't think that qualities need to be supported by things underlying them. Now, I should point out at this juncture that the Nyaya philosophers have a lot more to say about qualities and substances. They have a lot more to say about that general metaphysical view that what exists are ultimately qualities and substances where the qualities are supported by substances, and they can offer that defense independently of what they say about the self. But focusing on the self, there's one last objection to the argument that we should note. This is the point that psychological qualities like desire cannot adhere in body, cannot be supported by something material. A lot of philosophers today would say that all that exists is ultimately material, that there aren't immaterial substances, there aren't things like souls that are immaterial, not made of matter. And on that view, consciousness can be reduced to or explained in some way by material things, by matter in space and time. Now, there are philosophers, on the other hand, that will still support a distinction between mind and body as being something really strict, where mind cannot be reduced to body. But note that in the argument that we looked at, there isn't much said by way of support for that premise. And so the Nyaya philosopher needs to say a lot more to argue for that really strong claim that the self is a psychological substance distinct from matter. But in any case, that step isn't so important for what we're focusing on, because the Nyaya philosopher could perhaps establish that there's a self that underlies various mental qualities, and that it's a substance that exists, and that would respond to the Buddhist challenge, if you can point to any sort of substantial self. But, of course, we want to consider what motivates the whole debate in the first place, and part of what motivates the debate is thinking about whether there's a permanent self or not. And we'll turn to that question in the next lecture.